Hi everybody, my name is Bronwyn Edwards. I'm the CEO of Roses in the Ocean, and I've been very fortunate to also be one of the facilitators for the co-design process for the Northern Beaches pop-up safe space. So today we're going to present to you what came out of that co-design process, and then you'll have an opportunity to contribute further if you've already been part of it. But for those of you who weren't in that process, this is an opportunity to hear what the project's all about, what ideas have come to the table so far, and then you'll be able to contribute your own ideas through the online survey that will accompany this webinar. But first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the North and Queensland, pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge people with a lived experience of suicide, and thank you so much for the courage that you show every day in bringing your insights into suicide prevention initiatives like this. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen with you now, and we will start. All right, so pop-up safe spaces, co-design for the Northern Beaches. The process that we're involved as general community members who have a lived experience of suicide. This co-design builds on a lot of co-design around safe spaces that's happened across the country in the last couple of years. And it's really important, though, that a localised co-design occurs so that the pop-up safe space is really meeting the very specific needs of your particular area. So we ran a full day's co-design session broken up into a couple of different sessions and an online survey which make up a feedback loop. So that will all be disseminated throughout community and hoping to get as many people to respond to that survey as possible. All of those outputs will then be taken back to the working group for another co-design workshop where we'll start populating a service model design for the pop-up safe space. All right, so first of all, just a bit of context for those who are new to the whole concept about what a safe space is. It's a drop-in style support for people who are experiencing emotional distress or suicidal crisis. It's a place that offers a warm and welcoming environment. It's non-clinical, and it's really, safe spaces have been developed in recognition of the fact that places like emergency departments and acute clinical services are not the best fit for people who are in emotional pain and distress, and that they don't address the broad range of situational and social stresses that lead to suicidal crisis. So safe spaces are staffed by suicide prevention peer workers who have their own lived experience of crisis, who can really connect through that mutual understanding, someone who's walked in very similar shoes, and be able to support people. And there's a real emerging evidence base for the therapeutic value that suicide prevention peer workers bring in promoting that hope and healing to people, and really being able to support them through that space of crisis and connect them with support that will assist all has the National Safe Spaces Network review really played a role conceptual and modelling the safe space around. Through the process of doing that, I think we've really been able to speak to so many people in metropolitan and regional communities, lots of different community stakeholders, and we've really been able to identify common themes that have emerged about what people with lived experience in community are looking for and wanting from a safe space. So Roses in the Ocean decided to actually assist communities to design, develop and run their own pop-up safe spaces. What we have noticed is that when funding goes through the actual traditional health system, co-design outputs aren't necessarily honoured in full. And so for communities to have a very pure, non-clinical, peer-led model, we really want community to be able to design that. So it's community design, managed and staffed. It's a non-clinical space. It may be to that premises of what your emotional price. And specialised practice. There's a lot of scaffolding and support and training provided to the volunteer peers. There's always a minimum of 2 peer companions rostered on at all times. The pop-up safe spaces have a no wrong door approach with really strong connections in and out of the safe space so that you can make great support connections to support that people decide they want. So self-determination is incredibly important, and the pop-up safe space is very risk tolerant. So the 7 key components of a safe space that we have over the last 3 years of co-designing with I guess, identify of what people are asking for. Trauma and wrong door report that meets the holistic needs of guests, compassionate and capable peer-led workforce, a safe and accessible location, warm and welcoming environment, warm connections to appropriate and reliable supports, and shared governance and management. Of course, that all needs to be underpinned by the values and principles of peer work and the values and principles of safe spaces. So the first thing we did in the co-design was to explore emotions and feelings that were related to accessing support when the person was either in crisis themselves, or if they were a carer of someone, a friend, a family member, just a trusted person who was trying to find support for someone. We also recognise to access and talk about what that felt like and what their needs were at those times. So in terms of finding support, just when you're at that stage where you really felt you needed to get some additional support, people talked about feelings of being scared and defeated, miserable, frustrated, cold, and feeling like a criminal. There's a number of quotes here. I'll just slides these in, you can read it all in full. Said, look, the place is sterile. Staff all sat in a big room with black glass all the way around, so they were safe in there. Young people said to me, what happens if someone does attack one of us? They're in there and we're out here. That doesn't seem right to us. Who's going to look after us? There was a comment about being in a mental health ward where there were a lot of people who are coming down from drugs and what have you. Another person said, my mind was in a fog. They told me to go up to ED, so I went. No one else knew that I needed help. And I felt that it would have been better to have someone that I could talk to while I was lying there, someone that would touch you, make you feel some warmth. It was just a really scary experience. Talking about arrival and that initial assessment that occurs in the clinical settings, the feelings of feeling awkward and foggy, powerless, frightened, and for some relief that they had actually gone somewhere where they hoped they'd get some help. The reasons why they were feeling people spoke not to. One person who looked at that she's not okay. Another comment, because of physical injuries, she was completely broken on that. So that's discussion. It was here for me came in with this as a result in being incredibly distressed. About feeling useless and whilst we were waiting hours and hours, could see to, and we were being uninformed of what is happening, if anything. In terms of treatment, terrible, and aid, being a patient would have been a luxury, as it was more like a prisoner. Nurse focusing on someone else's physical injuries is so much easier. And the fear of realising that they didn't know what to do. And basically, we then, when they feel defeated, when told time to keep her alive, but she came out with a lot more tricks and so we then really wanted to look at needs, and we took the participants through a whole exercise of identifying the different needs that they had felt at those different times. And then once we'd identified those, we then asked them to look at how would your pop-up safe space meet the needs of its guest. And we asked them to dream big, obviously understanding that everything that they would love to see now probably won't be possible straight away in terms of being open 24/7, for example. That's something that's always asked for. That, of course, depends on the size of your volunteer workforce. So, but we really wanted to capture the blue sky dreaming such that you've always got something that you're working towards. So we'll just show you the slides that combine both of those main activities together. So from a practical and physical perspective, we asked people to identify what are your needs. So people talked about needing something to eat and drink for guests and also the carers, comfortable seating areas, warmth, space and breakout areas, transport, and for the place to be accessible to people. Just the smells, you know, those freshly baked cakes or something, to have a little kitchen to be able to actually create that real homely environment, access to charge phones and access to emails or internet. So then when they were brainstorming about how could you meet those needs, it was, as I said there, that small kitchen area for tea, coffee, cakes, you know, a place where you could actually be baking something, having comfortable seating areas, cozy chairs, blankets, hugs, nurturing atmosphere. In terms of the actual layout of the space, ideas around having some separate room or rooms for private discussions. If it's a really large open space, there was also mention of being able to just create some separate spaces through plants or soft room dividers. There's a bathroom and ideally an outside area where people could just get some fresh air. Sort of just, and the of accessibility was that it would be open 24/7 ultimately. If that's not possible straight away, then the idea was to be open from Wednesday to Sunday nights. So Wednesday to Sunday nights and Monday during the day. Talk about the bus that goes up and down the coast, and that you said that team just as an umbrella and have your peers there, so that mobile bus idea was interesting. Sometimes this is another potentially pop up key as well, independent commercial sponsorship. If people are nervous about being recognised, pop-up safe space could be located so that it's not really why you're going in there, because there's lots of things in that particular area. You could be using existing services after hours, for example. There was an example made of a headspace office, but then there was also some conversation around trying to avoid being aligned with any existing mental health service, because we know that there's a number of people that don't relate to that mental health because of the visible lighting would be good, and that it's easily accessible on a main thoroughfare with public transport. The kitchen again, and having just spare phone chargers and having computer access and what have you. Okay, then we looked at experience for the guest. What are the sorts of things we needed to consider around what's it going to feel to walk into a pop-up safe space? The needs that were identified was that we needed people in there who understood non-clinical support, connection with someone, to know that there's actually a pathway, that if you come to the pop-up safe space, not only will you be supported and the space that you are, but there will be the opportunity to be connected into possible other things that may assist you. So a pathway for you, that you can really trust where you are. So when you walk in the door, someone looks at you and smiles and said, "You've come to the right place. I'm so pleased you're here." That there's some support for transport for people, that it's nurturing, and that there are volunteer peers who absolutely understanding. So people brainstormed about how to meet those needs, really wanting guests to have a sense of belonging and connection, and to see when they walk in that it's really comfortable space, greeted as a person of value, warmly welcomed, given a sense of confidence that you're in the right place and you're surrounded by people who care. Comment that it could be freeing for someone who's used to accessing clinical services to arrive and not being made to provide information and history. That it might be better to mix around ride sponsorship, EasyLink, social enterprise, private schools have buses. You may be able to set up some sort of arrangement, perhaps locate on the B line that runs from Palm Beach to Neutral Bay. And in terms of that nurturing environment, a real freedom of choice, letting people know that it's absolutely okay not to be okay. Guest choice and control. Therapy dog was very popular, and ensuring that there are some sensory items in the space for people to use if they'd like to. And also understanding that the peer role is to hold space for people. There was questions around duty of care, and so a really great conversation around what that looks like in a community-led volunteer space, and making sure that there's really good training for peers, which is something that we are providing to the volunteer peers as part of this project. Connection needs, and that's meaning connections into the pop-up space and out. People identified the needs of being able to have peers called to assist first responders in community if needed, and seeing if you could develop a relationship with first responders such that they would call and engage a peer worker from the pop-up safe space to go with them and be with them. Peer support to be called upon to ED if someone presents there, and then that peer could travel with them or walk with them back to the pop-up safe space depending on the location. Making sure that the person walked out with a bit of a plan in terms of what are the next steps? What am I going to do? The rest in terms of move. Have one to talk to that isn't a friend or family was a need that was identified. And also consent So in meeting those needs, they were really keen for the peers to have good training, the peer care companion training, assist training, reflective practice. So really be trained and supported to really adopt and embed reflective practice into their work. Having a shared vision for safe haven support from all organisations. So really trying to get that community buy-in. Offering a safety plan, but more like they weren't sort of talking more like that, more non-clinical, holistic, sort of daily, one of the called it a daily lifestyle adjustment plan. But really I do every time, so I need to be doing when I start feeling like I'm getting distressed, something very practical. Make sure that this pop-up safe space provides resources and options for people to choose from, phone, online and printed. Phone and internet access so people can access chat lines while they're in the space. Questions around who pays for that and needing to get creative and work out how we can set that in place. Having a list of contacts and resources for guests. And for the pop-up safe space to be very proactive in making sure that they have up-to-date phone numbers, that they are connecting people to supports that are really helpful and that are reliable. Building a cohort of available, trained and committed peer volunteers. And definitely be able to offer get consent to call that instead of leaving to that guest. And then when we look at a no wrong door approach, people really wanted, there was a need that there are skills to support all guests, regardless of who walk the door, consideration for some others, a clear plan and strategy for all, so never get way. Just the fact that the peers have the training and they know that there's a plan and a strategy for supporting that person and guests and so. And skill hand ditch where people are exhausting resources. So meeting our needs, they talked about the training again for the peers. The group decided that a surveillance camera wasn't appropriate for safety, but always having 2 or more staff rostered on. And it's an area that will require more conversation around how if for whatever reason there just was an issue where you needed some additional support from a safety perspective. Training on de-escalating certain situations following a process, separate space, to be able for the guests to be able to be taking to the way, and just really understanding the reason why people have come to you. Why have they walked into the pop-up safe space? That there's no judgment at all, and that there's a shared understanding that we're working with and not against people. Understanding and working with, say, homeless services, Burdekin Street Work, Wesley Mission. So really looking at having expansive networks in community so that you can, and if anyone turns up with all sorts of different underlying issues, social things that are going on, that you've got the understanding and the knowledge of how to connect them with a service that could be helpful for them moving forward. We then really work of the community beaches. Do you need me to this table? Making sure that this safe space is as inclusive as it can be. So talked about there being, it's a really large geographical area with a number of cultural differences. Up north, quite privileged area. Down south, a Pacifica culture. There are challenges in how various cultures manage mental health, that there's violence and institutes. The group talked about the many emotionally homeless young people and the fact that they are quite invisible to community in many areas. In some parts of the area, a high drug scene and some gangs and a strong masculinity or surf culture, are concerned that there's a lot of men in the area that are suffering in silence. So in terms of meeting the needs, it really needs further exploration and further ideas. So hopefully you've got some of those to put into the survey. Suggestions around location initially were around Narrabeen, Brookvale, Myrnavale, that the north and south areas need to be serviced, and that the location will also depend on what space is available. So I guess the word of caution there is you won't necessarily be able to service the entire area, and it's about wherever the location ends up being, really making sure that the realistic catchment for people to come to that space, that you're really meeting the needs of that, with a view to opening more pop-up safe spaces when you can. We then shifted to values and looking at the values of a pop-up safe space, explaining that that's really sort of the internal compass for making all the decisions going forward around this particular community venture. And the group came up with a number of values. Ideally, after the survey process, we'll hopefully be able to condense these down to sort of 5 to 7. You'll see there the top 3 that came through. We actually asked people to provide their top 3 values, and then we just pulled it together a little bit. So respect, connection and compassion were very strongly supported in the co-design. Exclusion, determination, kindness, empathy, consistency and generosity. All fabulous. Look and see the survey as well. We then worked to really think a lot more deeply around how you honour the values and principles of safe spaces and peer work and support people. So in various groups and had conversations, and then came back and discussed things further. Scenario 1 was that Chantelle is a 14-year-old teenager who arrives at the pop-up safe space experiencing suicidal thoughts. It's the first time she's ever reached out for help, and she's frightened by what she's experiencing. She doesn't know where else to go. In this scenario, it's 8 o'clock at night, just 30 minutes before closing time. The purpose of this is to determine how people aged under 18 will be supported, determine how the safe space will manage supporting guests within organisational constraints, such as limited opening hours, and determine what the scope and nature of support is to guests beyond direct support. So some of the ideas, do we say that we're closing soon and the child needs to gain help at ED, not to refer somebody at that vulnerable stage? So the group decided, no, we don't want to be referring a young person to ED. Questions of, do we stay longer? Can we have a roster of people coming in? A family member, is it reliable? What happens if the person doesn't have somebody that you can call and that can come and be with them and support them once this place closes? Definitely a conversation to be had around what next steps, what is the plan. Being a minor at 14 years, there is absolutely a duty of care not to leave her alone. You can certainly give her options to go to the ED, and if she chooses to do that, the peer support worker would go with her to get further support. But they really landed on actually having a roster of people who were happy from the volunteer pool to actually come and relieve others if they needed to go, such that there really was an assurance of support for anyone who was at the pop-up safe space and was really not connected enough to head home. So other ideas around, it doesn't shut at 8 p.m, it's a safe space. So I think, they're looking at having hours that go later than that. Need a guardianship at that time and for that age, potentially contact Bertigan, street work or kids, get her out there or get them to collect her, provide respite and overnight care. Feel confident that she's backed up and not exposed to other issues. Questions around what are the legalities of driving a child, these unusual members of the level of involvement. So that was really about needing to match the peers depending upon their comfortable level of involvement, and making sure, once again, the peer workers are really well trained to handle these scenarios. Second scenario, Leanne walks into the pop-up safe space. She knows the space well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. She had previously told a peer care companion it is a place where she can relax for a while, knowing that she's safe from self-harming while she's there. Tonight, she appears to be intoxicated and is quite agitated that the peer care companion who she now feels she can trust isn't available to talk with her. She's becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest has indicated that it's making them uncomfortable. The purpose of this was to determine how the pop-up safe space will work with guests who appear to be intoxicated, determine how it will work with guests whose distress may express itself as aggression, and explore ways that peer workers will manage competing needs. So it was discussed that around there being that trade-off between safety and emotional well-being, apologising to her that her peer support worker that she's used to and really trusts isn't there, but assuring her that she is safe and that there are other peers here to support her. Need to assess how diffuse this simple task to start with. Be from other guests, remove her others if mean stresses. Make sure that there's always a minimum of 2 peers rostered on. And will be important to ascertain what's causing the intoxication. Is it marijuana or alcohol? Is it ice? And need to consider how she'll get home safely. The fact that you could try to call someone who could come and get her, make sure that she's not driving. Scenario 3 talks about a young man who's been connected to the safe space from a multicultural services organisation who arrives at the safe space. He's accompanied by a lady of similar age who he doesn't introduce. He appears a little agitated with the woman, but seems happy to have arrived at the space. He accepts a cup of tea, and while he's chatting quietly with them, he keeps glancing towards the woman. It's discovered she is his sister and is really keen to stay with her. The purpose of this scenario is to determine how the safe space would meet that young man's needs, how it would support carers or natural supports of people in crisis, how to identify and honour the wishes of the guest regarding the role of their carers, and determine what other potential supports could be offered to carers or natural supports. So firstly, there was a suggestion that we could separate the 2 people initially and take to a private, quiet area so that you could support the as well. It's about and for the care again. The breakout rooms in the safe space allow these conversations and for others who are sitting around. Off cover of on involvement, and that's seen and could report back to the family. So just that sensitivity required in situations that perhaps the man is not comfortable with the carer. There may be gender-specific support needed to be provided. Therefore, we need to drive perhaps to recruit men and males to be members of the pool of the peer care companions so that they can respond to the needs of guests who particularly want to speak to either a man or a woman or in situation. And also for carers that needing support, living carers also to carers the same as guests and require support, and the answer that they came up with was yes. Now, scenario 4, David turns up at the Safe Space Hub for the first time. He seems quite agitated and distracted. He'd heard about the Safe Space from a community services worker who supports him in a program for people with complex and enduring mental illness. He tells the peer worker that his neighbour's trying to control his thoughts through a chip he has planted in his television. David says he can't handle the torment of this anymore and feels that killing himself is the only way to get relief from it. The purpose is to determine how the safe space approaches the support of guests who've been identified as having a serious mental illness. to determine how the safe space supports guests who identify as experiencing suicidal distress as a direct result of what clinicians would understand as symptoms associated with psychosis, and determine what non-clinical support looks like in the context of supporting guests with a diagnosis of serious mental illness. So, responses, the pop-up safe space is not a crisis service or provides support for people with complex mental health issues. However, it is a no wrong door service, so would provide support as best that it could. However, the group talked about this and they decided that actually the pop-up safe space absolutely is a crisis service. It is there for people who are in crisis, and that the peers would be absolutely trained to support people through crisis. That it's just so important to sit with him and listen to him without judgment, that not to doubt or question David's experiences. Ask him if he has seen his caseworker recently. Remind David that his TV is not here in the pop-up space, safe space to cause harm, and asking him, do you feel safe here? Where and how we can best serve him, centre him and calm him so he's not leaving in that state, and provide a really warm handover. So potentially have good connection, well, definitely have good connections into community where there are pre-organised handovers to perhaps the emergency department if that's where David needs to go, or just back to into the service that has been supporting him already. Now, there's another scenario that we didn't actually do in the co-design session, but it will be in the survey for you. And it's about a 20-year-old woman who has a history of past suicide attempts, who comes to the safe space extremely distressed. She says her life is not worth living and that she's tried everything to stop feeling this way. She tells the peer worker that she's been on dozens of different medications, tried therapy for childhood trauma, done everything the psychologist told her. Nothing ever works, and she has run out of options. When the worker asks her if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has the means and is just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone. Her history of previous attempts is known to one of the safe space peer workers who had previously supported her in ED. So the purpose of this one is to determine how the safe space will respond to guests who are characterised as at imminent risk of suicide, determine how they support guests who are highly suicidal to ensure their safety, and determine what peer workers will need in order to support guests who are highly suicidal in an effective way. So that will be in the survey for you to think about and provide your feedback. The last thing we did with the group was to ask them what is each person was to provide us with their absolute one non-negotiable. So what this helps us to do is actually, it's the beginning of starting to form the principles of the pop-up safe space. So these were the not negotiables from the group. A minimum of 2 peer care companions rostered on at any time. No wrong door approach, inclusive of all ages. Internet facilities and phone, nurturing and warmth in the atmosphere, attention and care to the environment, that the ambience is absolutely welcoming, and unconditional positive regard. All right. So thank you all for listening to that. As I say, we'll send you the link to this webinar and the online survey, which will be open for a week. So please circulate it to as many people as you can within your community who have, a lived experience of suicide, and carers, people who are bereaved, people who've made attempts or live with suicidal thoughts. We really want to hear from all of those people so that the pop-up safe space in Northern Beaches can really meet the needs of everyone in your community. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the next stage.